I know
Everyone
where
in
it is,
Greenwich thought
but
Kate
I can't
Sterling
stay
was
here.
just Richard's quiet young wife.
Meet me at the bridge in
They
10
never knew she
minutes,
had another
alone.
name, another past, and a father the world had every reason to fear. When Richard crosses the final line, Kate makes the call she swore she would never make. And the truth about Katya Belova begins to tear his perfect life apart.
He struck her so hard she hit the marble floor before she could even make a sound. His ring cut her cheek, and she immediately tasted blood. And in that moment, with her hands cradling her pregnant belly, 29-year-old Kate Sterling looked up at her husband and felt something inside her finally shatter. It was not her spirit or her will to live, it was her patience. You see, what Richard Sterling did not know, what no one in their rich Connecticut town ever cared to find out, was who Kate's father really was. And tonight, he was coming for his daughter. Now, if you are already hooked on this story, please hit that subscribe button to follow Kate's incredible journey. And I would love it if you left a comment telling me what city you are watching from. It is amazing to see how far our stories travel. Rain had been pounding the windows since 4 o'clock. That cold, driving Connecticut rain that was turning the long private driveway into a slick, black mirror. The iron gate at the end of the drive stood 14 feet tall. Along the stone wall, security cameras blinked with small red lights, almost lost in the storm. From the outside, the mansion looked like a fortress, the home of a man who had spent 30 years making sure everyone knew just how much money he had. Inside, Kate stood at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She was listening, but not to the wind and rain, or the furnace kicking on, or the television she had left on in the living room, just for some background noise. She was listening for the sound of tires crunching on the wet gravel. She was listening for the specific rumble of Richard's car, the heavy slam of the door, and his shoes clicking on the stone path. For the last 3 years, those were the sounds that warned her to get ready. She put the mug down and rested a hand on her stomach. 7 months. She would whisper those words to herself like a kind of prayer. 7 months. The baby shifted, a slow rolling feeling right below her ribs. Kate exhaled slowly, just like the therapist she had secretly seen twice had taught her. She had to stop going after that second appointment, because Richard found the receipt. Then, at 9:47, headlights cut across the kitchen window. She heard the engine die. She heard the car door slam. She heard his footsteps coming up the walk. She picked up her mug, carried it to the sink, and stood there with her back to the door. She had learned long ago it was better if he did not think she was waiting for him. Looking like you were waiting made him angry. Then again, looking like you did not care also made him angry. There was no correct way to stand, no safe look to have on your face, no tone of voice that could keep her safe. But she had learned what was more dangerous and what was less. She moved through these silent rules like someone who learns to live in a house with a weak floorboard. You always step carefully, and you never, ever forget it is there. The front door was yanked open. He always pulled it way too hard, making the sound echo through the marble hallway. She heard his keys hit the table. She heard him let out a frustrated sigh, and then she turned around. Richard Sterling was 54 and had been a handsome man for most of his life. He was tall, with broad shoulders, perfectly styled gray hair, and blue eyes that could almost look kind if the light was just right. He was wearing his charcoal suit, the one for city meetings, and it was soaked through at the shoulders. His face was tense in a way she knew all too well, a quiet rage bubbling just under his skin, like pressure building beneath a sheet of ice. He just stared at her, saying nothing. "There is soup on the stove," Kate said, her voice completely steady. She had gotten very good at keeping her voice perfectly steady. "And I made that bread you like. It is still warm." Richard strode right past her, ignoring the food, ignoring her. He went directly to the liquor cabinet, poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, and drank half of it in a single swallow. Kate just stood where she was and waited. "Hennessy pulled out," he said at last. She knew better than to ask what that meant. She knew Hennessy was some huge development deal he had been working on for nearly a year. She had heard the name whispered on phone calls she was not supposed to hear, in conversations that would stop the second she entered a room. "I am so sorry," she said. "Are you?" he sneered back at her. It was not a real question. He picked up his glass and finished the whiskey. "You're sorry. That is a huge help, Kate." "Really? Thank you. Is there anything I can do?" He laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "What could you possibly do? What value do you even bring to this marriage?" He slammed the empty glass on the counter. "I have been carrying this whole house, this entire marriage, everything, for 3 years. The one time I need something to go right, I come home to you just standing here, looking at me like a scared little rabbit." Kate kept her arms hanging loosely at her sides. "I am not scared. You should be," he said, and then he started walking toward her. And that was it. That was the thing she had learned to watch for. That flip of a switch from his controlled anger to something much, much worse. It always happened so fast, faster than anyone who has not lived it could ever believe. 1 second he was by the counter, and the next he was just 3 feet away, then 2, and the very air around him felt different. It felt sharp and dangerous, like the air right before lightning strikes. "Richard." Her voice was low, not from fear, but from some deep animal instinct. "Richard, stop." "Stop what?" "I am just standing in my own kitchen, in my own house." He was close enough now for her to smell the whiskey on his breath, and something else under it. The bitter smell of a man who has been stewing in his own rage all day. "You're going to tell me to stop? Who do you think you are, Kate? What would you possibly be without me? Please do not do this tonight." "Do what?" "Talk. Have a conversation with my own wife." His hand shot out and grabbed her upper arm. It was not hard enough to leave a bruise. He was always very careful about that, but it was tight enough to hold her in place. "I need you to understand what this just cost me. The lawyers, the setbacks, the way you have been. My God, you have been nothing but a burden around my neck since our wedding day. You are hurting me." His voice dropped to a whisper, dangerously calm. His grip got tighter. "I am talking to you. The baby," she said, saying the word on purpose. She had learned that sometimes just that one word could stop him. "Richard, you are going to hurt the baby." A strange, complicated look passed over his face. For a single second, she thought it had worked. She thought she saw the anger in his eyes begin to fade. And then his phone buzzed in his pants pocket. He glanced down at it, and whatever he saw on that little screen destroyed the last bit of his self-control. He shoved her hard with both hands on her shoulders. She stumbled back, her arm banging against the sharp edge of the kitchen counter. And that is when he hit her, an open-handed slap across the right side of her face. It was so forceful, her head snapped sideways, so hard that her vision went completely white for a second. And then she was falling, her knees hitting the hard marble floor first. Her hands flew out instinctively to catch herself. She heard a strange, choked sound come out of her own throat. She heard him say something, but the blood was pounding too loud in her ears. She was on her knees on the kitchen floor, one hand pressed to her burning face, the other held flat against her stomach, shaking all over. But she realized it was not from weakness, and it was not even really from fear. It was just a physical reaction. her body reacting to the shock of the blow. She could taste the metallic tang of blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. "Get up," Richard said. His voice was cold now. When his voice turned cold, it was somehow even scarier than when it was full of rage. "Get up off the floor. You look pathetic." Kate looked up at him. She had looked up at him from this same floor before. Twice, to be exact, before tonight. She was keeping score. She always was. And both of those times, something inside of her had tried to make herself smaller, quieter, to do anything that would make him stop. But this time it felt different. She had no idea what her face looked like in that moment, but Richard actually took one small step away from her. She pushed herself up, slowly, using the counter for support. She stood on her own 2 feet, her hand still against her cheek, and looked her husband directly in the eye without blinking. "I am going upstairs," she said. "We are not finished here." "I am going upstairs," she said again. The exact same words, the exact same calm voice. And something about her steady repetition, about how even her voice was, made him go quiet. She walked straight past him out of the kitchen, through the cold hall, and up the winding staircase. She could feel his eyes on her back the entire time. She did not look back once. She went into their bedroom, shut the door, and just stood in the dark for 30 seconds, pressing her forehead against the cool wood and forcing herself to breathe slowly. She crossed the room, sat on the bed, and pulled open the nightstand drawer. Her fingers moved past the lip balm, the book she'd been stuck on for 6 months, and some antacids. Then she found it. A phone. But it wasn't her phone. Not the fancy one Richard paid for, the one he could track anytime. Not the phone he checked when he thought she was asleep. This was a cheap, prepaid burner she'd bought with cash at a gas station months ago. She kept it hidden in her purse and moved it to this drawer every night before he came home. She bought it for an emergency. When she turned it on, the screen lit up the darkness. After 3 months in a drawer, it still had a 40% charge. She just stared at it. Her cheek was already starting to swell, and she felt the hot sting of a bruise forming under her skin. Her hands were shaking, so she clasped them together to try and stop them. The phone had only one contact. Just one. No name, just a number with an international code. A number she memorized when other kids were learning their multiplication tables. She promised herself she would never, ever use it, and she meant it. She knew when she bought it, knew as she typed in the number in that gas station parking lot with trembling hands, that using it would change everything. It would burn bridges that could never be rebuilt. It would start a fire she couldn't control. She sat on the bed, her hand on her swollen cheek. Her unborn baby stirred inside her, and she thought about those bridges. She thought about what was on the other side. She thought about who she was before she became Mrs. Richard Sterling and what that woman would tell her to do right now. She pressed call. It only rang twice. A voice on the other end said, "Katya." It was deep, accented, and perfectly calm, the way truly dangerous men sound, because they've never had a reason to be anything else. It was a voice that hadn't changed in the 10 years since she last heard it. "Papa," she said, but then switched to Russian without thinking. Her childhood language just took over, the way it always did when she was scared. It never asked permission, it just appeared. She spoke 4 simple sentences, explaining what happened and what she needed. There was a 3-second silence on the other end. "Where is he now?" her father asked. "He's downstairs." "Is the gate code the same one you sent me?" She had sent it 3 months ago, the same day she bought the phone. Just in case, she'd told herself. "Yes," she said. Go to the east wing, her father said. The room at the end of the hall. Stay there. Do not open the door for anyone unless they say the name. What name? She asked. Sunrise, he said. You remember, and she did. She was only 7 years old when she learned it. It was the safe word. The word that meant your family was coming to get you, that you were safe. How long will it be? She asked. We are already in Connecticut, her father replied. Then the line went dead. Kate sat there, the phone in her lap. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In through her nose, out through her mouth. The baby moved again, a slow somersault high in her ribs. She pressed her palm against the tiny kick and whispered in Russian, what her mother used to say, "We are all right." We are going to be all right now. She stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the rain. For a second, she only saw her own reflection. The swollen cheek, her dark eyes, the nightgown that had become her uniform. Then she looked past her own reflection to the gate at the end of the long driveway. She could just see the small, red, blinking light of the security system. She watched it for a moment. Then she turned from the window, left the bedroom, and walked down the hall to the east wing. Downstairs, Richard had poured a third whiskey and was in his study, phone pressed to his ear, making a list of people to blame for a business deal gone wrong. His lawyer was number 1. His project manager was number 2. He hadn't gotten to his own name yet, and he probably never would. He was the kind of man whose entire life was built on his own success, so any failure had to be someone else's fault. I need you to call Franklin, he was saying. First thing in the morning, you tell him I want a meeting. Not a phone call, face to face. Tell him. He stopped cold. He heard something. It wasn't inside the house. It was coming from outside. A sound that just didn't belong. He went to his study window and looked out, but the rain was coming down too hard, and the night was pitch black. He couldn't see anything but his own reflection. Then the security light at the gate went dark. It just switched off completely. Richard frowned, pressing his face closer to the glass. Something was moving up the driveway, something long and dark and slow. Then he saw there was more than one. He counted 1, 2, 3. By the time he counted 4, he had pulled the phone from his ear, staring wide-eyed, his brain unable to process what he was seeing. 4 black SUVs were moving silently up his driveway. Their headlights were off, their wipers were on, and the rain almost completely hid the sound of their engines. Richard? His lawyer's voice sounded tiny and far away. Richard, are you there? Richard Sterling had survived for 30 years in cutthroat real estate by trusting his gut, and right now his gut was screaming. It was telling him something was wrong, on a level he couldn't even begin to imagine. I'll call you back, he said, and hung up. He went to his desk drawer and pulled out the pistol he kept inside, a 9mm Sig Sauer he'd bought after a rival made threats 6 years ago. The threats were nothing, but they had scared him enough to get a license. He hadn't even fired it in 4 years. He picked it up and checked the magazine, trying to remember what the instructor showed him. He was still standing there behind his desk when the front door of his mansion just swung open. He hadn't heard a knock. He hadn't heard the alarm. Both of those things should have been impossible. He moved from his study into the hallway with the gun held down at his side. He was afraid, but in that moment, he was more embarrassed by the fear than actually scared. The entryway lights were on. He could see the marble floor, the table with his keys, and the large mirror above it. And in that mirror, he saw 2 men stepping silently through his front door. They wore black rain gear, moving with a quiet, practiced skill that told him these were not men who came to talk. And more of them We're coming in right behind." "What?" He raised the gun. "This is private property." "I have a weapon." "I will." The man on the left just glanced at the gun with a look of bored disinterest. He reached out and simply took it from Richard's hand. So smoothly, Richard didn't even realize he'd let it go. He just stood there, empty-handed, staring at this man who now held his gun pointed at the floor like he'd held 1,000 others. "Mr. Sterling," the man said. His English was perfect, but with an accent Richard couldn't place. Eastern European, maybe Russian. "Please do not do that again. It creates complications that nobody here wants. Who are you?" Richard's voice was almost steady. "Who sent you?" "If this is about the Hennessy deal, Mr. Sterling." The man placed the gun on the table next to Richard's keys. That calm, casual move was somehow more terrifying than any threat he could have made. "My name is not important," the man continued. "The man whose name is important is waiting outside. He would like a word with you." "I am not speaking to anyone until you tell me what the hell is happening in my house." The man's expression didn't change at all. "Your house," he said. "Yes, we can certainly discuss that." He then stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door, toward the rain and the darkness. Richard Sterling looked at the open door, at the men standing on either side of it, and then he looked up the staircase that led to his wife. He was starting to understand that she had started something tonight far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. He walked to the door. Standing on the mansion's front steps, with rain pouring down and 4 black SUVs on his driveway, was a man Richard Sterling had never seen before in his life. He looked to be about 60 years old, maybe older. Age had settled on him like stone, not like extra weight. He wore a dark overcoat with no umbrella, and the rain didn't seem to faze him at all. Or maybe he'd just decided long ago not to worry about things he couldn't control. He stood with his hands behind his back, perfectly still, just looking up at the house. When Richard finally showed up in the doorway, the man's eyes shifted to him. They were pale eyes, blue or gray. It was tough to tell in the rain. And they looked Richard over with the slow, careful focus of someone taking inventory. "Mr. Sterling," the man said. His English was even better than the men inside, formal and nearly elegant. "My name is Mikhail Vulov. I believe we have a great deal to discuss." He paused. "About my daughter." Richard Sterling felt the ground beneath him start to give way, and it had nothing to do with the storm. He said, "I don't think Kate's her father is," and then he stopped. He was about to say the word dead, but the man standing right in front of him was very much alive. In that second, he realized that everything Kate had ever told him about her family had been a lie. "Yes," said Mikhail Vulov with the smallest hint of a smile. "I think we should go inside now." He walked through the front door of the Sterling mansion as if he already owned it. And as Richard would soon discover, that was not far from the truth. He did not look around the room like someone impressed by money. He glanced over the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the expensive paintings. It was how a man inspects a hotel room, noticing what is useful and ignoring everything else. 2 of his men moved in front of him, 2 more behind. No one said a word. They didn't have to. Richard Sterling took 3 steps backward, then forced himself to stop. Deep down, in some stubborn part of him, he was still Richard Sterling. And Richard Sterling didn't back down from anyone in his own house. He demanded, "I want to know who gave you the authority to set foot on my property." His voice had some of its old power back. Not all of it, but enough. "Whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing, you should know I have lawyers who will." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling." It was not a request. It sounded polite, like one, but underneath was something as hard as steel, and Richard heard it loud and clear, so he sat. He dropped into the chair by the fireplace, the one his wife sometimes used on Sunday mornings. He sat stiffly, like a man pretending he chose to sit instead of being ordered. Miki Vulov did not sit. "My daughter," he said, "called me about 47 minutes ago." "Do you know what she told me?" Richard said nothing. Vulov continued, with the calm patience of a man who had done this many times. "She told me that her husband struck her while she was carrying his child." He let that sentence hang in the air for a moment. Then he added, "She told me this in Russian." "Did you know she spoke Russian, Mr. Sterling?" After a pause, he whispered, "No." Vulov clasped his hands behind his back. "There are many things you do not know about my daughter. We will get to them. But first, answer one simple question for me. I like to know who I am dealing with. Did you strike her?" Richard's jaw tightened. "That is between my wife and me." The man to Vulov's left, the one who took his gun, took a half step forward. Just a half step, but Richard felt it like a sudden drop in the room's temperature. "Did you strike her?" Vulov asked again, his voice unchanged. It was. There was a disagreement. Things got out of hand. "I did not mean to. Yes or no, Mr. Sterling?" The silence in the room was crushing. Richard Sterling looked into Miki Vulov's eyes and saw a patience that never needed anger, because it always won in the end. He was the first to look away. "Yes," he said. Vulov gave one slow nod, like a man who already knew the answer but needed to hear it. "Thank you," he said, "for your honesty. It will make things easier." He then turned and walked toward the grand staircase. Richard started to get up, but two of the men shifted, and he sat right back down. He did not need to be touched. He understood. "Where is she?" Vulov asked, not looking at Richard but at the man to his right. The man pulled out a phone, spoke Russian into it, listened, then said in English, "East wing, end of the hall." Vulov went up the stairs. Richard sat in his chair, listening to the footsteps, and counted the men left in the room. 3. And more of them outside. He did the math, and he really did not like the answer. Upstairs, in a dark room at the end of the east wing, Kate heard the knock. She was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, her knees pulled to her pregnant belly, clutching a burner phone. She had not turned on the lights. It felt safer in the dark, where she couldn't see her own reflection. She did not want to see her face. Then the knock came. 2 short taps, then 1 long one. A signal she had not heard since she was a little girl. She stood up and opened the door. Her father looked at her face for exactly 2 seconds. For just a moment, something flickered behind his cold, controlled eyes. Then he stepped forward and placed both hands on her cheeks, as gently as if he were holding something priceless. He turned her face to the light. The bruise was fully visible now. The right side of her face, from her cheek to her jaw, was deep red and already turning purple. Miki Vulov stared at it for a long time. He lowered his hands and said very quietly in Russian, "I should have come sooner, Papa." Her voice cracked on the word, and she hated it. She hated sounding so weak. But she was 7 months pregnant. Her face was throbbing, and her father was here, for the first time in 10 years. Her body just could not keep up the act of being okay. "How did you even?" She stopped, switched to English, then back again. "I did not think you would come yourself." "Where else would I be?" he asked. He stepped into the room, looked at her with his full attention, and said, "Let me look at you." He was not looking at the bruise anymore. He was looking at her. The way he used to when she was little, as if he was measuring her strength. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" The baby is fine." I checked. "I have been monitoring." "Good." He pulled a chair from the corner and put it right in front of her, then sat down. That simple gesture, him sitting, putting himself below her eye level, it broke something open inside her. "Sit," he said. She sat on the edge of the bed, and they just looked at each other. 10 years, she whispered. 10 years, he agreed. You did not come to the wedding. You did not invite me. Because you knew. She stopped, biting her lip. I knew what you would have done if you had met him. I knew what you would have found out. I wanted. She looked down at her hands. I wanted to believe I had made the right choice. I needed to believe it, without you there to prove me wrong. Vulov was quiet for a moment. And now, she looked up at him. He hit me, Papa, while I am pregnant. While I was carrying his son, her voice was strong again. She had found her resolve in the last 30 seconds. That was the third time. The third time. She watched her father's face as he took in that number, watched his absolute stillness. It was not a lack of emotion, but a powerful, tight control of it. You should have called me after the first time, he said. I know. Why did not you? And that was the real question, was it not? The one she had been asking herself for the last 2.5 years. She looked at her father, this man who raised her in a world of power, violence, and unbreakable loyalty. The man who sent her away at 19 because he wanted a better life for her. He had watched her go and respected her wishes not to follow. And she tried to find the real answer. Because calling you meant admitting I failed, she said. And calling you meant becoming your daughter again. Not Kate Sterling. Not just Kate, but Katya Vulova. Your heir, she paused. I was not ready for that. And now, she looked at him, her gaze unwavering. He hit me for the third time, while I am 7 months pregnant. I am ready. Downstairs, Richard Sterling had been sitting in that chair for 9 minutes. He was counting. He was also studying the men in the room, searching for any weakness, any opening he could use. There were no openings. These men were not security guards or nightclub bouncers. They were something else entirely. He knew it the way a rabbit knows the difference between a dog and a wolf. He tried a new tactic. I want to speak to whoever is in charge, he announced to the room. No one moved. The man who came in, Vulov. I want to talk to him now. He tried to put his commanding boardroom tone back into his voice. I understand he is upset. As a father myself, I can respect that. But there are 2 sides to every story, and I think if we all sit down, the 3 of us, Kate included, we can. Mr. Sterling. The man who had taken his gun was looking at him. We appreciate your patience. I am not being patient. I am being. You are being patient, the man said, with a tone that slammed the conversation shut like a steel door. Richard closed his mouth. For 30 years, he had been the most powerful person in nearly every room he entered. He had always known it. But not in this room. Not anymore. The feeling that this night was completely out of his control had been growing since the SUVs pulled into his driveway. Each new realization was heavier than the last. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for it slowly, watching the men, but no one tried to stop him. He glanced at his phone screen. It was his lawyer. He picked up. Richard, what's going on? You were supposed to call me back. I need you to look up a name, Richard said, his voice low and steady. Right now. The name is Miki Vulov. He's Eastern European, maybe Russian, involved in real estate or something called Vulov. There was a short pause on the line, then a much longer one. Richard, where are you? I'm at home. Why? What is it? I'm looking. His lawyer's voice cracked, all his earlier confidence just gone. Richard, the Vulov name. There is a Mikhail Vulov tied to the Vulov syndicate. This is. I mean, the government has files on these people. Richard could hear the frantic sound of typing. Richard, you do not negotiate with people like this. You don't. Why do you have this name? He's in my house, Richard said. The silence that followed lasted for 4 very long seconds. Get out of there, his lawyer whispered. Now, whatever you have to do, just get out. Richard glanced at the 3 men around him and the 2 more guarding the front door. He thought about the staircase where Vulov had disappeared 20 minutes earlier. I really don't think that's an option, he said, and hung up. 23 minutes had passed. When Vulov returned, he walked with the calm certainty of a man who knew exactly how this would end, and Kate was not with him. Richard noticed right away. Where is my wife? She is resting, Vulov said, taking the chair right across from Richard. It wasn't Richard's chair, but a smaller one set up to face him directly. He was perfectly calm. She needs her rest. We won't disturb her. She is my wife, Richard said, hating the desperate sound of his own voice. Whatever she told you, whatever you think happened, I know what happened tonight, Vulov stated flatly. My daughter told me. You told me, and the bruise on her face proves it. He leaned back just a little. Mr. Sterling, I want to tell you about my family. I think it will help you understand your situation. He paused. My daughter grew up in a world most people don't know exists. She was educated in 4 countries. She speaks 5 languages, including one she stopped using when she married you. From a young age, she was trained to manage enormous assets, navigate complex legal systems, and make decisions most wealthy men like you never have to face. He watched Richard for a reaction. She left that life because I gave her a choice. I loved her enough to let her go down a different path, and she chose you. Richard said nothing. She chose a man, Vulov continued, who had no idea who she really was. Who just saw a beautiful, quiet, intelligent woman and thought she was something he could control, something he could break. He tilted his head. How long did it take before you hit her? Silence. 8 months, Richard said. He wasn't sure why he said it. The words just came spilling out. Vulov just stared at him. 8 months into your marriage. Richard started to make an excuse, but stopped himself. There was nothing he could say. 8 months, Vulov repeated slowly. She stayed for 3 years. I want you to think about what that says about my daughter's hope. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the whole room seemed to shrink. And I want you to think about what it means that she finally called me. My daughter would only make that call when she was completely and totally done. Richard's mouth felt dry as dust. What do you want, money? I want you to listen, Vulov said. He wasn't angry, not even a little, which was somehow much scarier. You are going to listen to me, and you will understand what happens next. Then you will sign the documents my people prepared, and we will be done here. Documents, Richard sat up. What documents? I haven't agreed to, Mr. Sterling. Vulov just raised a hand, and it was enough to silence him. You hit my pregnant daughter 3 times during your marriage. Tonight, you hit her hard enough to make her bleed. I have a doctor on the way to document her injuries. I also have financial investigators who just spent the last 90 days looking into every account and company you own. He paused. I have been preparing for this day since she married you. A cold chill ran down Richard's spine. You've been watching me. I have been protecting my daughter, Vulov corrected. There is a difference. She didn't know. It was her choice to live without my help, and I respected that. But I was prepared, because I know men like you, Mr. Sterling, and I knew this call would come. He reached inside his coat, pulled out a document and placed it on the table. Divorce. A full transfer of all assets. The Greenwich house, the New York properties, the 3 accounts in the Cayman Islands. Yes, I know about those too. Everything goes to my daughter. Complete and without a fight. Richard stared at the papers. He looked up. And if I don't sign, the room went so quiet you could feel it. The silence of men holding their breath. Vulov looked at him for a long, heavy moment. Then we will have to discuss the alternative, he said. And I promise you, Mr. Sterling, you do not want to discuss the alternative. Richard's hands were shaking, so he pressed them flat on his legs. His mind was racing, thinking of every option, every person he could call, every favor he could ask for. But every idea just fell apart. He was beginning to see that the man across from him had already thought of every possible move, like a chess master playing against a child. You can't do this legally, Richard said. These documents won't hold up in court. I'll fight you. You will find, Vulov said quietly, that they are perfectly legal, completely solid. They were prepared over the last 6 weeks by 3 of the best lawyers in New York. He paused. And you will find that the evidence of your assault, plus the financial crimes my team uncovered, will make fighting this much more painful than just signing. Richard's voice was a whisper. Who are you? I told you who I am. No, Richard looked at him. I mean, who are you, really? Kate told me her father was a property developer from Eastern Europe. She said he died when she was 12. She said, Vulov interrupted, what I instructed her to say. There was a flicker of something like guilt in his eyes. I made her say that to protect her, so that anyone who got close to her couldn't get close to me. He looked at Richard with an expression that was almost pity. It wasn't fair to her. I see that now. Upstairs, in a room down the hall, Kate Sterling sat with her hands over her stomach. Her back was straight, her face calm, like someone who has no more tears left to cry. It was not peace, but it was resolve. She listened to the rain against the window and thought about being 19 years old, putting her father on a plane and promising him she would have a normal life. She thought about what that normal life actually became. The first year, she believed in it. The second year, she saw the cracks. By the third year, those cracks were giant holes. But she was so stubborn, so determined not to be Katya Volkova, that she accepted things that no woman should ever accept. She stayed in a house that felt like a cage, telling herself every single morning that this was her choice, that she was the one in control, that she was not her father's daughter. She pressed her hands to her belly, and the baby moved, a slow, steady kick. She was her father's daughter. She always had been. And tonight, sitting in the dark in a mansion that no longer belonged to Richard Sterling, she finally stopped fighting it. That truth settled over her, not like a cage, but like a suit of armor. She heard footsteps, then a soft knock. One of her father's men opened the door. "Ems, Volova," he said. It was the first time in 10 years she had heard that name. It felt different now. Not like a chain, but like a key. "Your father wants to know if you are ready to come down." Kate looked at the door, then at her hands. She pictured Richard's cold face in the kitchen, staring down at her on the floor. The absolute certainty that she was nothing to him. She thought about the simple respect he gave everyone else, but never her. And then she stood. Yes, she was ready. She walked to the top of the stairs and looked down into the hall of a house she'd lived in for 3 years and never once felt safe in. She saw her father sitting across from her husband, the document on the table between them. She saw Richard's face when he heard her steps, when he looked up and saw her standing right there. And for the first time since their wedding day, Kate watched Richard Sterling look at her with fear in his eyes. She walked down the stairs slowly. Her entire posture had changed from just 2 hours ago. Something in her spine had straightened itself out. It was not a defiant act or a performance, but the quiet return of a part of herself that had been waiting a very long time. She moved across the rooms and stood beside her father's chair, where Richard looked up at her. "Kate," he said, his voice completely hollowed out, all its usual power gone. What was left was weak and small. "Kate, please listen. Whatever he told you, whatever promises he made, this isn't you. You are not one of these people. You're my wife, and we have a baby on the way. If you would just—" "Richard," her voice was quiet but final. "Sign the paper." He just stared. "Sign the paper," she repeated. "And this all ends tonight. Everyone can go home. You walk away with your health and whatever your lawyers can salvage." She held his gaze. "Do not sign it," she warned, "and my father will explain the alternative. And I promise you, Richard, that is not a conversation you want to have." She watched as he searched her face for the woman he married, for the obedience, the fear, the smallness he counted on, and saw that she was simply gone. Or maybe she was never really there at all, just borrowed for a time, and the loan had just been called in. He reached for the pen. It scratched across the page at 11:22 p.m., Richard Sterling's hand shaking so badly his signature was a total mess, nothing like his own. He knew it. He stared at that weak, trembling version of his name, and something inside him just gave way. Like a building that doesn't fall all at once, but collapses floor by painful floor. He dropped the pen. Nobody spoke. Vulov's man, the one with the bored look, picked up the paper. He glanced at the signature and gave Vulov a short nod. Vulov looked at it for a second, then folded it and put it in his coat without a second thought. Just another task completed, another box checked off a list. Richard stared at Kate. She was still by her father's chair, hands on her belly, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. He searched for anger or satisfaction, anything, but found only a deep calm that terrified him more than any rage ever could. "You planned this," he said, his voice empty. "You've been planning this all along. I made one phone call," Kate said. "Tonight, right after you threw me to the floor. Don't," his jaw tightened. "Don't you dare make this sound simple. Don't make it sound like—" He jumped to his feet so fast the two other men in the room tensed, and only froze when Volkov calmly raised a hand. Richard just stood there, shaking with a rage that had nowhere to go. "You lied to me. For 3 years, you lived in my house, and you lied about everything. Your family, your real name, all of it." Kate looked at him, her gaze steady. "I never lied about who I am. I showed you exactly who I was. You were the one who chose to see me as something smaller. Your father is." He gestured wildly at Volkov, his face a mess of anger and confusion. "Do you have any idea what your father is, what he does? And you think I'm the bad guy here? You grew up with Richard." Her voice cut straight through his rant. It wasn't loud, just sharp and precise. "You hit a pregnant woman tonight, in your own kitchen. Everything else is just noise." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Richard collapsed back into his chair. He had nothing left. Volkov rose from his seat slowly and buttoned his jacket. He looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and contempt, like someone watching a boring movie he'd already seen a dozen times. "My people will be in contact with your lawyers in the morning. I suggest you tell them to cooperate. Any delay, any challenge to the divorce settlement, any contact with my daughter that she doesn't initiate herself, will be seen as you choosing to explore your other options." He paused. "I trust I don't need to spell out what that means." Richard was silent. Good, Volkov turned to Kate. He spoke to her softly in Russian, and she answered him back. For a moment, the conversation was just for them, a world he wasn't part of. Then he kissed her forehead, on the side without the bruise, a formal yet tender gesture. He walked to the door and stopped at the threshold, not turning around. He said in English, making sure Richard could hear, "In my experience, Mr. Sterling, a man hits a woman because he's afraid of what she'll become if he doesn't." He opened the door. "Tonight, you found out." And with that, he walked out into the rain. Kate stood alone in the entrance hall of her house, listening to the cars pull away until their engines faded into the storm. 2 of her father's men stayed behind. She hadn't asked them to. She was sure her father hadn't either. They were simply staying. It was just protocol, and Volkov's protocol was never up for debate. Richard was still sitting in his chair. She looked at him, truly looked at him, in a way she hadn't let herself in a very long time. Because looking at something that painful requires a kind of courage that's hard to find every day. He looked old. Not his real age. He was only 54, but he had always worn his years like a perfectly tailored suit. But in that moment, he just looked tired, a deep exhaustion that had settled into his bones. She almost felt something for him. She inspected that, almost feeling, really thought about it. The way they taught her in the 2 therapy sessions she was allowed to have. And she decided it wasn't pity. It was more like looking at a cornered animal that was no longer a danger. The fear doesn't disappear just because the threat is gone. But you start to see it differently. "You should get some sleep," she said. "I am going to need you to be clear-headed tomorrow. There are calls that have to be made." He looked up at her. "Are you serious? There's a guest room on the 3rd floor," she went on. "I think it would be for the best if we did not share a bedroom tonight. Kate." His voice cracked when he said her name. It sounded like a support beam finally snapping in two. "Kate, I know. I know I've been. I know tonight was." "Richard," she stopped him. Not cruelly, but with a firm sense of finality. "Don't. I have heard that sentence so many times. I know every single version of that apology. The one where you're sorry. The one where you promise it will never happen again. The one where you blame stress for making you act like someone you're not." She shook her head. "I'm 7 months pregnant, and I am standing here with a bruise on my face, and my father's men are in my kitchen. We are way past the version where you get to explain yourself." He just stared at her. "Go upstairs," she said. "3rd floor. Get some rest. We'll deal with this tomorrow." He finally stood up. He walked to the staircase, put a hand on the railing, and paused with his back to her. She could see the effort it took for him to start climbing those stairs. It wasn't physical. It was the effort of a man walking into a future he didn't build and certainly did not want. "Did you ever love me?" he asked, without looking at her. She thought about it, wanting to give him an honest answer. "Yes," she said. "In the beginning, I did." He nodded once, like a man accepting a hard but necessary truth. Then he climbed the stairs, and she listened to his footsteps fade until a door closed somewhere on the 3rd floor. She stood alone in the hall. The 2 men were in the kitchen. She could hear one making coffee, which on any other night would have seemed insane. She pressed both hands to her belly, closed her eyes, and took a single deep breath. Then she went into the sitting room, switched on a lamp, and sat down to wait for morning. She didn't sleep. She knew she wouldn't. She sat with her feet tucked beneath her, because her back had been aching for a week. And she let her mind sort through what had happened, like walking through a flooded house, taking stock of the damage. What was broken? What was still standing? What could be rebuilt? And what had to be left behind for good? At 2 in the morning, one of her father's men knocked quietly on the door and said her father was on the phone. She took the call in the sitting room, keeping her voice low, just out of habit. Then she stopped herself. That habit belonged to the old house, the house where Richard was always listening. She didn't live in that house anymore. The thought felt like hearing a lock finally click open. "The doctor will be there at 8, her father said. "This is for the official record. It has to be done before the bruises can fade." "I know," she replied. "How are you feeling?" The question was so simple and direct. 3 words no one in this house had asked her in. She honestly couldn't remember how long. She looked up at the ceiling, blinked, and said, "I'm okay. I'm doing better than I thought I would be." "That is the strength in you," her father said. She almost smiled. "Don't get ahead of yourself." There was a pause. "Katya," he used her real name. "We need to talk about what's next. Your position, your assets, the child's future. Not tonight," she said, "but soon." "I know," she told him again. "You do not have to handle this all at once." "I understand that," she said, adjusting the pillow behind her back. "But I need to know what I am inheriting. All of it. Whatever you've been managing for me, I want to properly understand it this time." There was another, longer silence on the line. When her father finally spoke again, his voice had a tone she hadn't heard since she was a little girl. In any other man, you might have called it pride. "Then we will sit down. When the baby arrives and you are ready, we will go through all of it." "Everything," she confirmed. "Everything," he said. She hung up and sat in the lamplight, thinking about that word, everything. What it meant, and what it would ask of her. The life she had tried to build for herself, away from her father's world, had turned out to be nothing more than a fantasy. Not because that life wasn't possible, but because she tried to build it with the wrong man, on a foundation that was shattered from the very beginning. The question wasn't if she could go back to the person she used to be. That was impossible. She was someone new now. She was a mother. 7 weeks from her due date, she was a woman who had survived, and the proof was on her face. The real question was what came next, what she would build, and who she would build it for. Pressing a hand to her belly, she felt the baby kick. She thought, "We'll figure this out." She said it like her mother always did, not as a comfort, but as a direct order. At 6:45 in the morning, she heard Richard come downstairs, much later than she expected. She figured he would have tried something in the night, a secret call, moving money, whatever cornered men like him always do. They act before they realize just how small the trap is. She was surprised he hadn't. Hearing his footsteps, she wondered if the fight had broken something in him for good. He stopped at the living room doorway. He had changed out of his ruined suit and was wearing a cashmere sweater she had given him for Christmas. That detail felt so strange. That of all his clothes, he picked the one from her. In the pale morning light, he actually looked smaller. Not pretending to be small for sympathy, but truly smaller. He was diminished, like proud men are when they can no longer hide from themselves. He looked at her face, at the bruise that she knew was darker now in the daylight. She watched his eyes register it, and saw something shift inside him that didn't feel entirely fake. "I need coffee," he finally said. "There's a pot in the kitchen," she told him. He left. She could hear him moving around in there, the quiet sounds of a man utterly lost in his own kitchen. 2 of her father's men were still downstairs. She heard Richard speak to them, a short, sharp exchange. Then silence, and the sound of a mug on the counter. He came back with coffee for himself, but not for her. He stopped, glanced at her empty cup, and asked, Do you want anything? It was such a small, pathetic gesture. She thought about it for a moment and just said, I'm fine. He sat across from her, but not in his usual big armchair by the fireplace. He chose a smaller one near the door, as if his power in the room had already disappeared. Clutching the mug with both hands, he stared at the floor. My lawyers are calling yours at 9, Kate told him. Tell your team to cooperate. Every asset my father marked is for a reason. Fighting it will cost you more than letting it go. He looked up. Is there anything left for me? She had spent hours thinking about this in the quiet of the night. The house in Aspen isn't part of the deal. It was bought before we were married, so it's yours. She paused. And whatever you build after this is yours too. I'm not trying to destroy you, Richard. I am leaving you. He was quiet for a moment. There's a difference. Yes, she said. There is. His eyes fell on the bruise on her face again. She let him look. Around 4 in the morning, she decided she wouldn't cover it up. Not today. Not in this house. For 3 years, she had made herself smaller, quieter. She was done hiding the evidence. I want you to know, he started, then stopped. I don't need you to. I want you to know, he repeated, his voice firmer now, which surprised her, that I understand what I did. I'm not making excuses. I'm not blaming stress or the deal. I understand what I did. He looked down at his hands. I don't know when I became someone who could do that. I don't know when it started, but I know it was wrong all 3 times. I know that. She listened, weighing his words. She had waited 3 years to hear him say this, and now that he had, she realized it wasn't nothing. It did matter that he said it. She could admit that to herself, but it was also completely, totally too late. I believe you, she said. I believe you mean it right now, and I hope you remember this for the next person in your life. I hope you hold on to this feeling and let it change you. She stood up carefully. But it doesn't change this. She walked to the doorway, then stopped and turned back. I want you out of this house by noon, she said. Take what you need for a week. The lawyers will handle the rest. He looked at her. The woman he had married underestimated and hurt. The woman he thought he knew, and he nodded slowly, his eyes finally showing some real understanding. She went upstairs. The doctor arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. It was a woman, which Kate hadn't expected but was grateful for. Her name was Dr. Harmon, a calm professional woman in her 50s who did the exam with warm efficiency. She took pictures of the injury. She checked the baby's heartbeat, strong and steady, 150 beats per minute. A sound that let Kate take a full, deep breath of relief. She wrote everything down so it would be valid in court. She asked Kate if she was safe now, and Kate told her yes. Dr. Harmon glanced at the 2 men in the hallway and understood everything without another word. The bruise will look its worst in about 48 hours, Dr. Harmon told her. I want you to rest today. And I mean really rest, not the kind where you're still managing things from your bed. She gave Kate a look that was both professional and deeply understanding. Is there someone who can stay with you? My father is sending someone, Kate said. Good. Dr. Harmon packed her bag and paused at the door. For what it's worth, she said, and I know it's not my place. I have done this for other women. I've seen what happens to those who stay and what happens to those who leave. She looked right at Kate. You made the right decision. Kate thanked her and listened to her footsteps on the stairs. She heard the front door open, then close. A moment later, another car pulled in. It wasn't one of the big black SUVs, but something smaller. She looked out the window and saw a familiar woman, Elena, who had worked for her father since Kate was 12. Her face showed no emotion, but her competence showed in everything she did. She was getting out of a dark sedan, carrying a bag on each shoulder. Kate didn't know Elena was coming, but she wasn't surprised. She changed her clothes, brushed her teeth, and stood in front of the mirror for a moment. She looked at her reflection, at the bruise, the dark circles under her eyes, and the 7-month pregnant belly that had survived the night. She spoke quietly to her reflection. Okay. Then she heard the sound she had been waiting for, without even realizing it. The front door, footsteps on the gravel, a car door, and an engine starting. Richard was leaving. She didn't go to the window. She didn't watch him go. She had seen enough of him. She stood in the bathroom of the master bedroom. Her bedroom now. Just hers. She listened to the sound of his car driving away, the iron gate opening and closing, and then nothing. The rain had finally stopped before dawn, and a special kind of quiet settled over the house. Elena knocked on the door at 9:15. "There's tea," she said in Russian, "and the lawyers are on the line for you when you're ready." "Give me 10 minutes," Kate answered. She sat on the edge of the bed, the same spot where she'd sat last night with that prepaid phone, making a call she swore she would never make. She thought about who she was just 12 hours ago, hands shaking, blood in her mouth, terrified of what she was starting. She felt a deep tenderness for that woman, for anyone brave enough to do the right thing while scared to death. She glanced at her real phone. 17 texts and 4 missed calls from people with no idea her life had just shattered. She would deal with them later. She put the phone down and looked out at the gray morning, at the old oak trees she had always loved, which she would now get to keep for her daughter. They had found out it was a girl 6 weeks ago. Richard had wanted a son, and Kate had just stayed quiet, filing that information away. The baby moved inside her, a slow, rolling turn that Kate now recognized as a kind of restlessness. It was the same movement she felt every morning, like a tiny voice saying, "I am here now." "I know," Kate whispered. "I know. We're awake." She pressed her hand against the movement, holding it there. Beneath the exhaustion, the pain, and the sheer complexity of what came next, she felt something. It was a feeling she hadn't had in this house for a very long time. Something she had almost forgotten was even possible. She felt safe. In the hall, Elena set down a tea tray while the lawyers waited. Her father's men were quietly heading to their cars. The danger was gone. The Sterling mansion had, in a single night, become just a house again. It was Kate's house now. Her name was on a deed being processed in a Manhattan law office by 3 of the best lawyers her father's money could buy. At 9:25, Kate opened the door. "All right," she said to Elena in English, feeling a new strength settle inside her. "All right, let's get started." The phone call with the lawyers lasted 47 minutes. Kate sat in Richard's study, a room she was hardly ever allowed inside, a space that smelled like his whiskey and ambition. She listened to 3 lawyers talk over one another about asset transfers and legal orders, and how Richard's team might argue he signed the papers under threat. She paid very close attention. She asked 4 questions, but every single one was sharp, cutting straight to the point. When the call was over, the lead lawyer, Calloway, who had been her father's American attorney for 11 years, paused. "Miss Volova," he said, "I have to admit, you have grasped all this much faster than most of my clients." "Oh, I have been preparing for this conversation for the last 3 months," she replied. A brief silence followed. "Of course," Calloway said. "We will speak again at noon." She hung up and sat down in Richard's huge leather chair, the one he always sat in when he made her come speak to him in this room. She found that it fit her better than she ever would have guessed. It wasn't too big, not awkward in the slightest. She rested her hands on the heavy desk, glanced around the room, and thought to herself, "This all belongs to me now." At 10:15, Elena came in with more tea. She had the expression of a woman who has managed so many difficult situations that she'd almost become one herself. "Your father called while you were on the phone," he said. "He will call you back at 11. Oh, and there is someone at the main gate." Kate looked up from the papers she was reading. "Who is it?" "A woman. She says her name is Diane Mercer, a friend of yours." Kate froze. Diane was her closest friend here, maybe the only person she truly trusted. Diane was the kind of friend who would bring you soup without asking why, and who, 8 months ago, had seen a dark bruise on Kate's wrist and said nothing at all, even though her eyes told a completely different story. Kate had never told her the truth about Richard, trying to protect Diane, or maybe herself, or just the fragile idea of her own marriage. She was never really sure which one it was. "Let her in," Kate said. Diane walked in, looking like she'd been driving far too fast and was trying very hard to pretend she hadn't. She was 41, with sharp eyes that had seen a lot by simply paying attention. She stopped right there in the entrance hall, looked at Kate's face, and was totally silent for 3 long seconds. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." Kate felt a tight knot in her chest finally begin to loosen. It didn't break, it just relaxed, like when you find the perfect pressure point. "Tea," she said, "and to sit in a room that is not his study." So they moved into the sitting room. Elena brought them their tea and then quietly left, understanding this was a private conversation. Diane sat across from Kate, noticed the new bruise, and still didn't say what most people would have. There was no shocked gasp, no invasive questions. Diane just wasn't like other people. Kate said it plainly, "He's gone." "He left this morning," Kate continued. "The divorce papers are filed. The money is being transferred." Diane clutched her mug. "All of it? In just one night?" She just shook her head. "How my father?" Kate said. Diane stared at her. "Your father? The one who died when you were 12? Kate held her gaze. "He didn't." The silence that followed was the kind that forces your brain to reboot just to handle a new reality. Diane's mouth opened, and then it closed. She set her mug down on the table. "He has been alive this entire time?" "Yes. And last night he came here with several cars, several men, and a legal document that Richard signed." Kate's voice remained perfectly level. "So now Richard is gone. I have lawyers calling me every 45 minutes, and my father's men are here, making sure everything goes according to plan." Diane looked at her for a very long time. Then, in her usual straightforward manner, she asked, "Who is your father? Exactly, Kate." Kate took a slow sip of her tea before she answered. "He is the kind of man," she said, choosing her words carefully, "who, when his daughter calls him at 10 at night because her husband hit her, shows up in Connecticut in 2 hours with 4 cars and a pre-written legal settlement." She looked right into Diane's eyes. "The kind of man who has been watching my marriage from a distance, because he knew all along that Richard was exactly this type of person." Diane processed that. "And you are okay with all that? With who he is?" "I am 7 months pregnant with a bruise on my face, and my father got me out of here in one night," Kate said quietly. "I will deal with the morality of it all later." Diane reached across the table and took her hand, and she did not say another word. It was, Kate thought, the most perfect thing she could have done. At 11 o'clock sharp, her father called. As he always did, he got right down to business. "The Cayman transfers will be cleared by 4 p.m. New York is a little more complicated. Richard hid those assets under 3 different company names. His lawyers designed it specifically to make this process difficult. Calloway is on the case. It's going to take 48 hours, not 24. Is that acceptable? Yes, Kate replied. There was something else. A pause came over the line. It was short, but it felt incredibly heavy. Her father never paused like that, unless he was choosing his next words very carefully. Sterling made a phone call this morning. It was not to his lawyers. Kate felt that knot in her chest tighten right back up. Who did he call? A man by the name of Gerald Fitch. Do you know him? She vaguely recalled the name. He was a business contact from before they got married. Gerald Fitch is a Connecticut state senator, her father continued. Their relationship goes back 22 years. They have done things together that neither one of them would ever want to be investigated. Another pause. After he spoke with Sterling, Fitch made 2 phone calls. One was to a private lawyer who specializes in emergency legal orders. The other was to a contact he has in the state police. Kate's hand gripped the phone tighter. Richard is trying to fight the settlement. Richard is trying to create a narrative, her father corrected. He's going to claim he was forced into it, that armed men threatened him in his own house, and that the document he signed is not legally valid. A beat. He is not entirely wrong about the armed men part. Can he make that argument work? Not easily. The document is legal, the witnesses are solid, and your injuries are on the record. But it creates a distraction. It creates a delay. And in my experience, delays are the enemy of a clean resolution. A third pause, this one even heavier than the last. I need you to be ready, Kate. This could all go public. Sterling has political allies. If he pulls Fitch into this, it could hit the news before we are finished. Kate stood up from the desk and walked over to the window. She stood there for a moment, just looking out at the bare oak trees at the edge of the lawn. Let it, she said. I'm sorry, let it go public. She was surprised by how certain her own voice sounded. She let that feeling of confidence settle, testing it, making sure it was real. And it was. Richard has spent 30 years building a reputation based on power and control. But the real story, he is a man who hit his pregnant wife 3 times in 3 years and signed away his entire fortune the moment his father-in-law showed up on his doorstep. That is not a story that is going to help him. Not with his investors, not with his business partners, not with anyone. She turned back from the window. If he wants to make this a public fight, then let him. There was a long silence from the other end of the line. Then her father spoke, and she could hear the pride in his voice more clearly than she ever had in her life. All right. But Papa, I want it done clean. No extra trouble for us. Nothing that gives anyone any ammunition about your involvement, other than what is already written in the documents. Of course, he replied. That has always been the plan. They spoke for another 12 minutes, going over every last detail. When the call finally ended, Kate just stood there, holding the phone, thinking about what her father had told her. About Richard calling Fitch, about the emergency lawyer. She knew Richard would try something. She knew him that well. But she thought it would take him longer to act. She had figured he would need at least a full day to recover from the shock before his survival instincts kicked in. He must have called Fitch before he even left the property, maybe even before the sun was up. She felt a little flicker of something. It wasn't respect, but she had to acknowledge it. He was still in the fight. In just one night, she had taken nearly everything from him, and he was already on the phone with a senator. That, she thought, is what 30 years of fighting in the real estate world looks like when it gets cornered. It wasn't going to work, but she saw it. Diane had stayed. Kate found her in the kitchen with Elena. The two women were standing in that stiff, polite way that people do when they have agreed to tolerate each other for someone else's sake. The sight of it almost made Kate laugh, which was a genuine surprise. She did not think she had any laughter left inside her. "I have to tell you something," Kate said to Diane, "and I need you to just listen and not react for at least 30 seconds. Diane turned away from the counter. That is a very alarming way to start a conversation. Richard called a state senator this morning. He is trying to fight the settlement agreement. It might become public." Kate looked at her friend and did not blink. "I need to tell you something before it happens, because my father is involved, and he's not like anyone most people here have ever met. I want you to hear it from me so you can decide what to do." Diane crossed her arms. What kind of person is he, Kate? So Kate told her. Not everything, of course. She was still figuring things out herself, getting used to certain truths, but she told her enough. She explained the basic setup, the family business, the years they were apart, and the bond that somehow never broke. She told her about the phone from a gas station in Stamford, and the number she memorized at 7 years old. Diane listened, perfectly still, the way she always did when things got serious. When Kate was done, Diane asked, "Does any of this change who you are?" Kate really thought about it. "It changes the shape of things," she said. "But it doesn't change the center." At 1:45 that afternoon, the call came from Calloway. The news stopped Kate mid-sentence as she was talking to Elena about dinner. Richard's lawyers had filed for an emergency hearing. It wasn't a full challenge to the settlement. Not yet. It was a temporary restraining order to stop the money transfers, using the exact coercion story her father had predicted. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning at 9 o'clock in Westchester County. Kate stood in the hall, phone pressed to her ear, as Calloway explained it all in his calm, lawyerly voice. She felt the first true wave of rage she'd felt all day, a hot current washing over her. It wasn't because she was surprised. It was because of his sheer nerve. Richard Sterling had knocked her to the floor in his kitchen, went to bed, and then called in every favor he had, just to make her prove in open court that she deserved what was already hers, legally and morally. "Calloway," she said, cutting him off. "What do we need to win tomorrow? We have the documents. The signed agreement, the doctor's report, 2 witnesses. His story about coercion is weak. So what else?" There was a pause. "Miss Vilova, we need any documents from earlier incidents. The 2 assaults you mentioned. Any text messages, photos, medical records. Anything to show a pattern of behavior before what happened last night." Kate was silent for a moment. Her mind raced through 3 years of exhausted survival. "How fast do you need it?" "By the end of business today." She hung up and turned to Elena. "I need my laptop. And go to the master closet, top shelf. There's a dark green box behind the spare blankets. Bring it to me." Elena left without a single question. Kate went into the sitting room, opened her laptop, and began digging through files she had kept for 2 years and 2 months. It was a folder she'd given a dark, practical name, like someone who always knew she might have to leave. It was just called E for evidence. A folder she had never shown a single person. A folder she had added to, revisited, and sometimes just stared at before closing it, telling herself she wasn't ready. Well, she was ready now. When Elena returned with the box, Kate opened it. Inside were 3 pictures she had taken on her real phone, locked in the bathroom. 2 of them showed bruises. The third showed a cut over her eye. The one she told Richard happened when she walked into a cabinet door. There was also a single handwritten note she'd made after the second attack, dated and timed in the tight, neat handwriting she used when she needed to make something real. Something she could point to that existed outside her own memory. There was also a printed email from an address nobody knew she had, sent to itself. It was time-stamped, describing what happened with a cold, clinical detail that had taken an hour to write because she kept needing to stop just to breathe. She looked at the contents of the box, spread on the table. 2 years of quiet, careful, and exhausted preparation. 2 years where a part of her knew, even when she was too tired or scared to act, that this box might be necessary someday. She took a picture of each item on her phone, then sent them all to Calloway, along with the digital folder from her laptop. She was done by 2:40. Calloway called her back at 3:15. "This is more than enough," he said, and the relief in his voice was clear. "Tomorrow's hearing will not go the way Mr. Sterling thinks it will." She thanked him and hung up, sitting for a long moment with her hands folded in her lap. The box was still open on the table. She looked at the contents, the photos, her own note, and felt something else moving through her, besides the anger and exhaustion. Something she never expected. It was something she never thought she would feel, especially not today. Grief. Not for Richard, or not just for him, but for the years she had packed away in that little box. For the woman who took those pictures alone in a locked bathroom and then hid them because she wasn't ready. For all the mornings she told herself it wasn't that bad, that she was handling it, that she had chosen this life and could choose to leave it whenever she wanted. For the version of herself that believed for way too long that love was something you survived by shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's idea of you. She pressed a hand over her eyes. She gave herself exactly 90 seconds. She counted them. Then she closed the box, put it aside, and called her father. "The hearing is tomorrow morning," she said, as soon as he picked up. 9 o'clock. "I know," he said. "Calloway already told me. I want to be there." A pause followed. "Katya, I want to be there," she repeated. And her voice had that same quality she recognized in his, that deep, unbreakable certainty. "I am not staying in this house while lawyers argue about my face and my marriage. I will be in that room." Her father was silent for 3 full seconds. Then he simply said, "All right. And Papa, I do not want you there. I am sorry. I don't want you in the courtroom. And I don't want your men anywhere near it. I don't want the Vulov name attached to this tomorrow. I want it to be clean. I want it to be about Kate." She paused. Just Kate. Another silence. "This is a risk," he finally said. "I know it's a risk." She sat up a little straighter. "I've been living with risk for 3 years. I know what that feels like. I can manage it." She took a breath. "Let me handle this part." He took longer to answer this time. She could hear him, on the other end, doing that thing he always did when he was truly thinking something over. That little sigh through his nose. The kind of quiet that meant he was actually considering, not just reacting. She had forgotten she even knew that sound until right now. "You will have Calloway," he said at last, "and Reeves as your second chair. They are both excellent." "I know." "And you will call me the second this is over." "Yes. And Katya." He paused, then started again. "You were never just Kate. I want you to know that I understand why you had to be, but that was never all you were." She held the phone, looking at the window as the last of the afternoon light came in. She thought of the 19-year-old girl who got on a plane telling her father she was going to live a normal life. And she thought of the woman sitting here now, with a green box on her table and a bruise on her face. And 3 of New York's best lawyers were about to fight for her. She realized the distance between those 2 people wasn't as great as she had imagined. They were the same person. They had always been. One of them had just been hiding for a while. "I know," she said quietly. "I know that now." She hung up the phone and looked at the clock. 4:18. The money transfers from the Cayman accounts were complete. Calloway had confirmed it before her last call. The Greenwich property transfer was already in motion. The New York corporate assets were the final piece, and they would be handled tomorrow, one way or another. Diane was still there. She had moved into the kitchen and was doing what she always did in a crisis. She was cooking. And the smell was filling the house with a warmth that Kate had desperately missed without even knowing it. It had been so long since the house had smelled like anything other than pure tension. "Chicken soup," Diane said without turning. "Do not argue. You need to eat something that isn't tea." "I have a court hearing tomorrow morning," Kate said. Diane finally turned around and just stared at her. "What?" "Richard filed an emergency hearing to try and block the money." She sat down at the kitchen island. "I am going, Diane. I am going," she said again, "and I'm fine. And Calloway is the best lawyer in the state." She looked right at her friend. "But I need you to do something for me. Anything. The woman I have been for the last 3 years. The one who made herself small, who covered her bruises, who said she walked into a door. I need you to be a witness that she existed, that she was real, and that what happened to her was real." Her voice was perfectly steady. "Because tomorrow, a man and his lawyer are going to try and rewrite the history of this house. And I need to know that someone who saw it, even just the edges of it, is willing to say so." Diane stood perfectly still. "I will be there," she said. "You don't have to," Kate started to say. But Diane's voice was firm and clear, filled with the warmth of someone who had already chosen their side. "I will be there. In the waiting room. Wherever you need me to be." Kate just looked at her for a second. Then she gave one solid nod, just like her father did when a matter was settled. She ate the soup. She ate every bite, because Diane was right. She needed her strength. She was 7 months, pregnant and about to walk into a courtroom, and her body was the only thing she had left for whatever was coming. She ate slowly, deliberately, with the same focus she'd had all day. It was the focus of a woman who was no longer just drifting through life. She had finally started to live. Elena came into the kitchen at 7 and quietly said there was a development. Kate put down her spoon. "What kind?" "Gerald Fitch," Elena said. "The senator," he pulled out. She paused for a moment. "Apparently, a mutual friend of your father's spoke with him this afternoon. He told Richard's lawyers he can't help with the hearing and is no longer involved." Kate just stared at Elena, processing the words. Then she said, "My father." "I wouldn't know," Elena replied, with the perfect poker face of someone who knew everything. Richard had just lost his political shield. Without Fitch, the hearing was just a man with a weak case against a documented history of abuse and a signed agreement. Kate didn't feel a rush of victory. She felt the way you do when a storm you've been watching on the horizon finally moves away. It wasn't exactly relief. It was like exhaling a breath she didn't even realize she'd been holding. She went to bed at 9:30, the first time in 3 years she had picked her own bedtime. She lay on her side, one hand on her belly, and she just listened to the silence of the house. her house. She thought about tomorrow, walking into that courtroom with her name, her bruise, and her box of carefully gathered evidence. She thought about finally being in a room where the truth of what happened would be said out loud by people who could make it real. She wasn't afraid. She searched her own heart there in the dark, and she knew it was true. She was not afraid. She was something else. After a moment, she recognized the feeling. She was ready. The baby moved, a slow, deliberate turn inside her. "Tomorrow," Kate said softly, "we will tell them everything." She was awake before her alarm even went off. It was 5:47 in the morning. The room was dark and the house was quiet. Kate sat up in bed, hands on her stomach, already thinking about the day ahead. She had slept for 6 solid hours, better than she had in 3 years. It was simple, she thought. The body knows when it's finally safe. She dressed with purpose, not like a wife playing a role for one of Richard's parties. She picked a dark blue dress, a color she loved, but stopped wearing after Richard told her it made her look harsh. Standing in the mirror, she thought, "I look like myself again." The bruise on her cheek was a deep purple, exactly like the doctor said it would be. She looked right at it without flinching. For seconds, she thought about covering it with makeup, but decided against it. She was going to court to tell the truth, and the truth was written right on her face. Elena drove her there. Diane was already waiting for them on the courthouse steps, holding 2 coffees in the pale morning light. She looked like she hadn't slept at all, but she wasn't going to say anything about it. She handed one of the coffees to Kate. They didn't hug. This wasn't a time for comfort. It was a time for strength. Inside, their lawyer Calloway and his associate, Reeves, were waiting. In just 12 minutes, Calloway laid out the whole plan for the morning. It was fast, clear, and professional. Richard's lawyer was a man named Harov, a senior partner from a big, expensive firm. Calloway said he was probably shaken by Gerald Fitch suddenly backing out. He thought he'd have political cover, Calloway explained, and now he doesn't. That changes everything for their side. "So what's his argument going to be?" Kate asked. "He'll claim you were under duress, that it was a home invasion and your signature was forced." Calloway paused. "He'll also try to bring up your father's reputation." Kate just nodded. She knew that was coming. "And we will object every single time. And the judge will agree, because a third party's reputation is not relevant here." He looked at her seriously. "The evidence you brought us last night, Miss Volova, is the heart of our case. The photos, the note, the emails. They show this was not just a one-time event to get a signature. They show a pattern, a history." He met her eyes. "You might have to talk about that history. Are you ready for that?" "Yes," she said, without any doubt in her voice. They walked into the courtroom at 8:59. Richard was already at the other table, dressed in a dark suit with the silver cufflinks she'd given him years ago. From far away, he looked perfectly calm. But as Kate walked past him, she saw the tension in his jaw, the forced stillness of his hands. As she passed, his eyes shot to the bruise on her face. For just a split second, a dark look crossed his face. Then his lawyer leaned over and whispered something in his ear, and Richard quickly looked away. Kate sat down, folded her hands, and stared straight ahead, feeling a strange and powerful sense of calm. It wasn't the fake calm she had perfected over 3 years in that house, the kind you use to keep danger at bay. This was real. This was the calm of a woman with absolutely nothing left to hide. The judge, Patricia Wynne, entered at 9:04. She was 61, with reading glasses on a chain and a completely unreadable face. She opened a file, read for less than a minute, and then the long silence was finally broken. Mr. Hargrove, you filed to block a settlement signed last night. Tell me why." Hargrove shot to his feet. He was a big, silver-haired man who used his size as part of his argument. He described cars pulling up, strange men in the house, a threatening feeling. He claimed the signature was forced, not voluntary. He used the word coercion 11 times and foregrounded criminal elements twice, watching the judge for any kind of reaction. Judge Wynn gave him absolutely nothing. "Mr. Calloway, your turn." Calloway stood up. He was quieter, more precise. He presented the settlement, the witness list, and the doctor's report. He presented the photos Kate had secretly taken over the last 2 years. He showed the court a dated, handwritten note. He entered the emails into evidence, all time-stamped, written by a woman preparing for this very day. Then he argued that the real issue wasn't who was in the room that night. It was whether the woman who signed the papers did so willingly. And 2 years of her own records answered that question. Then he said, "Your Honor, my client is here and is willing to speak to this history if the court wishes." Judge Wynn looked at Kate over her glasses. "Miss Volkova," she said. And Kate knew, everyone knew. The judge had used her real name, not his. Volkova. Either her lawyer had briefed the judge, or the judge was just that good. "Yes, Your Honor," Kate said as she stood up. After being sworn in, she sat in the witness chair. She felt the baby shift inside her, a slow, settling movement, as if it was right there with her. The feeling grounded her. Calloway walked her through everything, one step at a time. The first time it happened, the date, the injury, and why she never went to the police. She answered every question with specific, clear details, not exaggerating or downplaying anything, just like her father had taught her. That was one thing she had held on to, even while pretending to be someone else. The second incident, the third, and then last night's events. Hargrove objected 7 times, but Judge Wynn only agreed with 2 of them. When Calloway finished, Hargrove started his cross-examination, sounding like he was just reading from a prepared script. He went straight for her father. "Miss Volkova, were the men who came to your husband's home last night working for your father, Mikhail Volkov?" "Yes," Kate answered. "And your father is the head of an organization that the United States Treasury has classified as..." "Objection," Calloway cut in. "Relevance." "Your Honor," Hargrove pleaded, "the character of the people involved is..." "I'll allow it," Judge Wynn said flatly. Hargrove turned back to Kate and repeated his question. Kate looked him right in the eye. "My father manages business interests in many countries," she said. "I'm not here to talk about his business. I am here to talk about the 3 times my husband hit me during our marriage." She paused. "If Mr. Hargrove wants to talk about that topic, I am ready to continue." Someone in the back of the courtroom gasped. Hargrove quickly changed his strategy. "Isn't it true you hid your family's identity from Mr. Sterling for your entire marriage?" "I did not share information about my family, no. And isn't that deception a form of..." "Mr. Hargrove." Judge Wynn's voice was quiet, but it cut right through the room. "Connect this to the restraining order, or please move on." Hargrove moved on. He tried 3 other ways to attack her story, but they all failed. Kate's calm, her precision, and her simple refusal to be distracted was a wall he just couldn't break through. She didn't have to get emotional. The evidence she had carefully collected for 2 years did all the talking for her. When he was finally done, he slumped down in his chair. Kate saw him lean over to Richard and say something quietly. Richard's answer was a single word she couldn't quite hear. Judge Wynn took off her reading glasses. She spent about 45 seconds looking over the documents in the silent courtroom. The motion for a temporary restraining order is denied. The judge said the evidence showed a clear reason for the agreement and proved a choice was made for personal safety. The asset transfers will proceed as described in the settlement. She then looked around the courtroom. I also want to note for the record that the medical file will be sent to the Westchester County District Attorney's Office for a review of potential criminal charges. That is all. She stood, and so did everyone else. Kate sat for just one moment longer before she rose. For just a moment, her hands were flat on the arms of the witness chair. Her eyes were fixed on the front of the room, thinking about the woman in the bathroom with the camera, taking pictures of her own bruises and hiding them away in a green box. She thought about what she would say to that woman. She'd say it all counted. Every careful, exhausted thing you did alone in that room, it counted. You were building something, even when you thought you were just surviving. She stood up. In the hallway, Richard caught up to her. His lawyer was 2 steps behind him, saying something low and urgent, but Richard wasn't listening. He stopped 3 feet away from her. They stood in the hall with Calloway, Diane, and Elena forming a loose circle around them. Richard looked at Kate with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't contempt. It was something stripped of both of those. "It's over," he said. He said it like a question that already knew the answer. "Yes," Kate said. "The baby." He looked at her stomach. "I want to be in her life. I know I don't have the right to ask. I know what I've done, but I am asking." Kate looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her daughter, the weight and reality of her, just 7 weeks away from entering the world. She thought about what that daughter deserved in a father and what she deserved in a mother who shows her what it means to face the truth. "That will be for the courts to decide," she said, "and for her to decide when she is old enough. I am not going to make that choice for either of you." She held his gaze. "But I will tell you this. The man who existed in that kitchen last night, I will not allow that man near my daughter. Who you become after this is up to you. That is entirely your choice." She paused. "I genuinely hope it is someone different." Then she walked away. She didn't look back. She walked through the courthouse doors, with Diane on her left and Elena on her right, and Calloway just behind. She stepped out into the morning, into the clean air of a day that was nothing the night that created it. She stopped on the steps and took a breath that filled her completely. Diane put her hand through Kate's arm. "Breakfast," she said. "Somewhere expensive. My treat." Kate almost laughed. Then she did laugh, a small, real one. The kind that comes from a place you forgot existed. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." Her father called at 10:20 while they were sitting in a quiet restaurant in White Plains. Diane had picked it because the booths were deep. Kate had ordered eggs and toast and was eating them with a real appetite, which she saw as a very good sign. "Calloway told me what happened," her father said. "I figured. Judge Wynn is a good judge." She was fair, Kate agreed. There was a pause. The referral to the district attorney. "I know," Kate said. "I expected it. It's fine. It is the right thing to do." She took a sip of orange juice. "I wanted it to go wherever it was supposed to go, without anyone interfering." Another beat. "Understood," her father said. And she could hear that he truly meant it. "Papa," she began, setting down her glass. "I want to start the conversations we talked about the business and the structure. I want to understand everything properly." She paused for a moment. "But I need 6 weeks first. The baby is due in 6 weeks, and I need that time. He agreed, of course, telling her to take all the time she needed. He said he wanted to sit down with her. "Just you and me," he'd said, with whatever documents she needed him to show her. No Calloway, no Elena, no one else in between. She heard the words come out and recognized her own father's tone, his precision, in her own voice. This was the inheritance she had been running from for 10 years. "I want to understand it directly from you," she had said. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 long seconds. Then Bakel Vulov said, "I have been waiting for that conversation for a very long time." "I know," Kate replied. "I wasn't ready before." She glanced at Diane, who was studying the menu intently, pretending not to listen. She watched the morning light pour through the window. She thought about the 6 weeks ahead, the baby on the way, the house that was now finally completely hers. She thought of the green box that had served its purpose and could now be put away for good, and the long journey of rebuilding her life on a real foundation. This time, it would be solid, not built on a performance and wishful thinking or a stubborn refusal to see the truth. She thought about the woman she was now, Katya Volova, who was once Kate Sterling, who had been a woman locked in a bathroom with a camera, who was once a 7-year-old girl memorizing a phone number, who would be a mother in 6 weeks, and who walked into a courtroom this morning with a bruised face, told the absolute truth, and won. "Now I am ready," she said to herself. She hung up the phone, picked up her fork, and ate her breakfast. 3 weeks after the hearing, the district attorney's office opened an investigation into Richard Sterling for domestic assault. The proof against him was overwhelming. 3 different incidents, 2 years of evidence, a doctor's report, and the testimony of a woman who was no longer afraid. Richard's lawyers released a statement saying he was cooperating. Kate didn't release a statement at all. She had already said everything she needed to say. 5 weeks after the hearing, the last of the corporate holdings were transferred into Kate's name. The complex legal maze Richard had built for a decade to protect his money had, in the end, protected hers instead. Calloway sent her a simple note. It just said, "Complete." She folded the paper, put it on her desk, and felt a weight settle in her chest, a sense of finality that was almost real enough to touch. 6 weeks after the hearing on a Tuesday morning, as the light hinted that winter might soon become spring, Kate's daughter was born. She was 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with dark hair and light-colored eyes that the nurses said would likely change. But in that first hour, they looked shockingly like her grandfather's. Kate just held her and looked at her, feeling a power she didn't have a word for. It was not just joy, though joy was part of it. It was bigger, holding the last year, the last 3 years, the last 10 years, all crushed into this one single moment. This child, this room, this very morning, this was a new beginning. She called her father from the hospital bed, with the baby resting on her chest. "She's here," Kate said. There was a pause. When her father finally spoke, his voice sounded different than she had ever heard it, stripped of all its power. "Just a man. Is she healthy?" "Perfect," Kate said. "She's perfect. And you?" Kate looked down at her daughter's face, at her dark hair and pale eyes, at the focused seriousness of a new person seeing the world for the first time. She thought about the woman she was just 1 year ago, on a cold kitchen floor, blood on her lip, hands protecting this child, who wasn't yet born, dialing a number she memorized at 7 years old and changing her entire life. "I'm good, Papa," she said. "I'm really good." Her daughter then made a sound. It was a small, impatient noise, the sound of someone who already had her own opinions. Someone who would not be controlled or dismissed or made to feel smaller than she really was. Kate looked at her and knew with total certainty that this child was going to be okay. She was going to grow up in a house that didn't have locked bathrooms or hidden boxes, or that low, constant hum of fear. She was going to know from the start what her mother had to take 30 years to figure out. That safety isn't something you get from the people who are supposed to love you. It is something you build for yourself, on your own terms, in a life that is 100% yours. Kate Sterling had walked into a marriage with a name that wasn't hers. She walked out of it as Katja Volkova, a woman who had been broken, hidden, and knocked to the ground, but who got back up every single time, who kept a box of evidence hidden in a closet for 2 years, who memorized an emergency phone number at age 7 and finally used it at age 29, who sat in a courtroom with a bruise on her face and told the truth until it was the only story left. She had done more than just survive. She had arrived. And in a room that smelled like disinfectant and new beginnings, with her daughter on her chest and her father's voice in her ear, her whole life was spread out before her. Like a door that was finally opened, Kate held on and did not let go.